Thank you so much, Andrew. Warm greetings to everyone. It is my pleasure to present the systemic issues that emanated from the inquiry process. As we were collating the data and putting the report together, we realized the interconnected and complex nature of most of the highlighted issues. And this affirmed the direction we are taking as a social lab, that is utilizing a systems-based approach to enable transformation within our sector. This presentation will focus on highlighting on the issues affecting the areas of stuckness and possibilities from the inquiry process that the 7 clusters went through. And all of you here were part of that process. Under the areas of stuckness, I'll highlight on the common issues or commonalities that came out of more than one cluster and specific issues of emphasis that emanated from individual clusters. With respect to the commonalities, 3 key broad systemic themes emerged: the nature of resistance that causes the stuckness, the atmosphere that creates the stuckness, and then the models and practices that sustain the stuckness. So now I'll focus on the nature of resistance that causes the stuckness. Here we interrogated 2 questions: how resistance to change manifests in the system, and how ego and fear contribute to resistance. Now, under how resistance to change manifests in the system, these were the issues that came out of the inquiry process. There's the recognition that the INGO sector keeps reinventing itself, but it's not transforming. There's low appetite for risk when it comes to handling public funds. And so people are kind of wary of investigations when it comes to public funds, and they find these processes painful and traumatic. There's resistance to feminist leadership. The powerful nature of patriarchy and the old boys club is clearly felt and visible. It is also evident in the LGBTI space, and it's difficult to call out and demand change. There's also continued existence of patriarchal and colonial funding models. Our organizational models are hierarchical, inflexible, and competitive. The vested interest of power holders underline international treaties and agreements. White people or Western folks are willing to give up power and privilege. And then, of course, our board compositions are still not represented enough. Even when minorities and people of color are invited, there's a perception that they are not willing or able to demand for change. Now, under the question of how ego and fear contribute to resistance, here are some of the issues that came out of the inquiry. The fact that there's a premium that is put on individual legacy and reputation by leaders. So this drives an egocentric way of doing things. The fear of letting go and taking less credit, wanting to be important, was seen as a serious challenge within our sector. The fear of losing power and relevance, so issues bordering on white fragility due to movements such as Black Lives Matter and the decolonizing aid movements and discussions and conversations. The fear of acknowledging responsibility for the problem. The fear of talking about personal experiences of racism. The fear of speaking out. So these were all the issues under the nature of resistance that causes the stuckness. Now I'll focus on the atmosphere that creates the stuckness. Now, under this section, we'll look at 4 questions. What are the belief systems and mindset challenges that create stuckness? How does Western superiority in the system create stuckness? How does power and politics play out to add to the stuckness? How does mistrust thrive to maintain stuckness? Now, under the belief systems and mindset challenges that create stuckness, narrative and assumption that Southern CSOs lack capacity and effectiveness. So this is a narrative that is still ongoing. The impact of large sums of money from donors, which inhibits collective action. The inability of smaller organizations to access funding because of the lack of supportive infrastructure and social capital within the funding space. Outdated beliefs of development as service delivery instead of rights-based approach or people-led approaches. Organizational growth and scale still given premium over relevance and impact. So how does Western superiority in the system create stuckness? Global South people of color are still considered backward, less knowledgeable, and riskier to associate with. Western people and Western ways of doing things are still considered more professional. So there's a lack of co-creation experience stands in the way of what? Genuine solidarity. Donor dominance has led to increasing professionalization within the aid chain. So it manifests in rigid accountability and reporting requirements. So the next question will be, then how does mistrust thrive to maintain the stuckness? So mistrust, the issue of mistrust. Implicit in the structuring of the aid chain is a complete lack of trust in CSOs from the global South, despite decades of investments and partnership. And then the lack of trust manifests in excessive control in terms of log frames, monthly reports, and bureaucracy. So then the last question, how does power and politics play out to add to the stuckness? So the realization that international cooperation does not fundamentally challenge or change the system or develop alternatives. The realization that INGOs do not operate in a vacuum, so they are part of a geopolitical systems, and those systems exist to keep power and prioritize national interest. And then of course, power dynamics within international aid manifests largely as a funding relationship and not a mutually respectful reciprocal partnership. And then of course, Western money is allocated based on foreign policy and vested interest. So these are the issues that came out of the inquiry process in terms of the atmosphere that creates stuckness. Now I'll focus on the models and practices that sustain the stuckness. Here we'll look at 5 questions. How have the role and identity of INGOs contribute to the stuckness? How has structural racism maintained the stuckness? How do existing models and practices in the system feed the stuckness? How has Western knowledge shaped the system and sustained the stuckness? How less priority and care in the system allows stuckness to persist? So on the issue of role and identity of INGOs contributing to stuckness, what came out of the inquiry process was that the role and identity of INGOs has become distorted and confusing. INGOs are operating largely as donors within the system. In terms of the issue on structural racism, maintaining the stuckness, what came out was that white people hold positions of leadership, power, and decision-making. White feminism has excluded and harmed many, including Global South women and LGBTI community. English language is still the dominant language within the sector. The aid chain has strong elements of structural racism. So if you look at the aid chain within international development, structural racism is embedded. There's a lack of recognition of this embedded structural racism. So the next question was, how do existing models and practices in the system feed the stuckness? So the models of decision-making are not co-created with those impacted. So they are not co-created with the communities that we are working with. The role of Northern gatekeepers does not give CSOs in the Global South sufficient voice, space, and resources. Traditional governance structure is often a prerequisite to access funding. So there's still a focus on traditional governance structures. And this is usually a prerequisite to access funding. And then the charity aid approach versus the justice, solidarity, and reparations approach, right? So aid is still focused a lot more on seen and perceived as charity, and conversations around justice and reparations seem to be stuck. They need to interrogate the NGO as an idea and model itself. So they need to look at NGO and what the NGO is, whether the NGO in itself, the way it's structured and operates, is fit for purpose. NGOs in the global North and South are constrained by heavy bureaucracies that govern the sector. Donor-driven reporting and accountability requirements limits the space for CSOs to define their own goals. So these are the issues that came out. So the next question was, how has Western knowledge shaped the system and sustained the stuckness? Knowledge is perceived as developed and controlled in the North. So this is still a perception. Knowledge is extracted from the global south and repackaged for the benefit of the sector without acknowledgement. Western knowledge is perceived as more important. And then the final question is how less priority and care in the system allows stuckness to persist. So there was a realization from the inquiry process that the results-based system has a little focus or little care for staff. Technology is deemed more important than participation and process. And then there's a prioritization of staff livelihoods over those of the communities we serve. Donors concerned about political and public backlash in case of failure. So these were the issues that came out of models and practices to sustain the stuckness. So these are the issues in terms of the commonalities or issues that cut across the individual clusters. Now I'll focus on the respective specific issues of emphasis by individual clusters. And these are the things that were discussed. So under the collaboration and solidarity cluster, they highlighted on the conflicting objectives between different stakeholders. So this whole conversation between professionalism, where organizations drive their legitimacy, INGOs drive their legitimacy from professionalism, but local partners drive their legitimacy from constituents and network-driven connections. So the conversation about service delivery versus people-led change, formal versus informal groups. Then the INGO cluster highlighted biased and ineffective measurement of impact. So the conversation about who defines the measures of success, measurement not being decided by communities themselves. Measurement is based on logic models, the lack of alternative measurement models, and then of course the fact that the resourcing drives what gets measured. The governance and accountability cluster highlighted on undemocratic and ineffective decision-making structures. So the lack of democratic procedures, controlled decision-making, the traditional board governance, which is seen as not transformational, the overbearing influence of donors. These are some of the issues that came out. The cluster also highlighted on the impact of an unhealthy regulatory environment. So the impact of anti-terrorism laws, security-related laws, right, that is creating bias in terms of regulations of the civil society sector in the global south. And then the incentives cluster highlighted perverse incentives around careers. So the number of years of experience being a determinant factor, which does not enable global south actors to access certain specific jobs. And then the patriarchy and feminist leadership cluster highlighted on the lack of self-awareness and the reluctance to be self-critical. So the idea that people with power often exercise this power without being aware of their power. So these were the issues that formed the conversations and issues that came out of the inquiry on stuckness. Now, I would like to focus on the common areas of possibilities. And here, we've structured it under the issues that we need to redefine, the issues that we need to redesign, the issues that we need to remove, and the issues that we need to co-create newly. So I'll start with the issues that we need to redefine and highlight some of those issues. One of the issues that came out was we need to move away from the North-South framing and realize that both North and South can learn from each other. The North can learn from the South, and that relationships should be reciprocal, and that learning should be two ways. And this idea that only the South can learn from the North should not be encouraged. So steps should be put in place to ensure this reciprocity and mutual respect between North and Southern actors. So redefining risk and proportionality, constructing new KPIs for INGOs, so more focused on downward accountability instead of upward accountability, redefining growth, moving away from this focus on organizational growth, but more focusing on relevance and impact, and then shifting this narrative around capacity of local actors, the fact that there's a perception that local actors do not have the capabilities or capacities, and then of course the public perceptions of aid. And then what we need to redesign is redesign our leadership models, integrating feminist models, community governance, looking at alternative governance structures. So looking at how we can make our boards even more dynamic, just not only about representation, but also about function. Looking at the culture of our boards, leveraging on movement building approaches, redesigning the roles of INGOs. So beyond the direct implementation approach, are there other roles of INGOs that INGOs could play that they should focus more on? Redesigning measurement criteria, redesigning funding models. So looking at leveraging on learnings from endowments, participatory grant making, etc. And redesigning risk models and looking at how we could design risk models that are more empowering and nurturing. In terms of removing, so the idea of removing this whole idea of tied aid or eliminating tied aid, and then of course, looking at how we can make the environment more enabling, regulatory and legal barriers to change. So anti-terrorism legislation that is causing huge mistrust of Southern CSOs, accounting regulations, reducing or eliminating complex reporting requirements and grant requirements, removing this idea of ad hoc activities and quick results. And then, of course, also closing down some INGOs that are seem not to be fit for purpose or relevant for the times, and creating exit strategies. And then co-creating a new, I think now there's an opportunity. What came out of this was that there's an opportunity to leverage on the conversations about decolonization and structural racism as a point of change. This is an opportunity to leverage on these conversations to make the changes that are needed within the sector. And then look at the values within the sector, move towards equity, justice, reciprocity, mutual respect as values that drive the sector. Change the whole idea of what knowledge is and where knowledge is produced and disseminated. Create avenues for knowledge documentation from the global South and exchange of knowledge with the North and vice versa. Change our approach to language, more space for translation and alternative languages. So going beyond English as the dominant language in the development space. Embrace technology to enable and diversify and amplify voices in decision-making. We have seen the impact of technology since we had the coronavirus outbreak in the opportunity to get connected more, the opportunity to increase efficiency. And so there's a need to leverage on technology adoption and adaptation. And then, of course, invest in innovation and disruption. Of course, realizing that we need to disrupt before we are disrupted. So thank you so much for your attention.